What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king, welcoming you back to more Let's Play Shadow of the Colossus. In the last episode, we took down Argus, the Sentinel, the gatekeeper of the city, and the second to last Colossus in this game. In this episode, we are not going to be going after the final Colossus. In fact, we're not going to be going after the final Colossus in the next video either. We're going to take a little bit of a break. And in this episode, I'm going to be going over the 8 cut colossi from this game. Yes, I know I've gone over these before in my original Let's Play of this game, but I kind of wanted to touch upon them again, especially because it has been such a hot topic, what with the remake of Shadow of the Colossus and why they weren't brought back into the game. Now, I do want to just preface by saying, yes, I do think maybe 1 or 2 possibly could have been brought back, you know, if they wanted to add extra bonus or content or something like that, but I don't think all 24 Colossus would have been something feasible, nor something really all of us would have wanted that much. I mean, I know you think you do, but some of the fights that were cut from this game really don't sound like they were all that fun, and or are just exactly what fights that are already in the game became. But on that note, we're going to talk about the very first one because we're in a relevant section, and I actually don't know off the top of my head on which side of the bridge it's located, but I know it's directly under the bridge, and the first one is the spider. Now, this is probably the most unique of the 8 Colossus, arguably the most unique, and was one of the earlier cut ones. As you can see from the images, they're a little old. At least it was placed in an environment that is still in the game to this day, so it actually might have been one of the later cut Colossi, but the spider, unfortunately, the fight revolved around a mechanic that is not in the game at all. Something that wasn't preserved in the game. And that is the fact that Wander could originally, at one point, slice with his sword while he was riding aggro. As you know, he cannot do that anymore. The only thing he can do with his sword is hold it up to the light. He can use his bow, he can do tricks, but he cannot swipe with the sword. And that was integral to the spider fight, and part of the reason why it was cut. The other reason it was cut, and this makes a lot more sense to me, was that, quote-unquote, the spider did too much damage. Now, what I really think they mean by that, and I think the translation means, is that the spider had 8 spindly legs. And having 8 spindly legs means that you have to worry about getting stepped on by 8 spindly legs. And the problem is, those hitboxes must be pretty exaggerated for 8 spindly legs. Think like Phaedra's legs, which were probably the smallest feet in the entire game, and yet still could do a lot of damage if she accidentally stepped on you. And I can tell you the hitboxes on those legs are pretty wonky, and it's easy to get stepped on by her. Now imagine that times 2 with the spider, and you're having to ride around it and also trying to slash at its legs while avoiding getting stepped on by those legs. I imagine it was just a really cumbersome task, something that probably could have been made better in the remake, I'm sure, but in the PS2 edition, it totally makes sense why that was cut, just because the hitboxes on the Colossi legs they're not the best. Let's just say that. You really don't actually have to get stepped on to, quote-unquote, get stepped on, if that makes any sense. So I can see why the spider was cut, but it was probably one of the most unique ideas. And it is a shame that it was cut. If there was any that they would bring back, that would probably be my first pick. But unfortunately, we do not have the spider anymore. As we head on over into this area, though, there's another one I want to talk about that was cut later in development, and probably my favorite of the 8, and the one I would have liked to have seen probably the most out of any of these, just because the idea was so cool, and it has some ideas that just aren't in the game in any way, shape, or form. Now, you see these trees? Now, here's a picture of the next Colossus we're talking about. I probably don't have the angle exact, but these trees, there's nothing else like them in the entire game. These dead trees. Nothing else exists in the game like this. So obviously, this is where the location of our second Colossus, the Phoenix, must have been. Well, indeed it was, and this is all but confirmed at this point. The idea with the Phoenix was that it was wreathed in flame. You could not touch it or you would get burned, unless you could get rid of the flames somehow. And the idea was to get the Phoenix to dive into a lake to get rid of those flames. Well, if this is the location, where the heck is the lake? I see geysers, but I don't see no frickin' lake. Well, believe it or not, in the Shadow of the Colossus PS2 preview version, pre-release version that was sent out to a few people and developers had and whatnot, this, under the bridge, this whole crevasse was actually filled with water. I know, isn't that hard to believe? But yeah, it totally was filled with water. It was not just a giant cliff that you could jump into and die. And that, again, that was the idea, was that you were supposed to get the Phoenix to dive into here. How you did that based on its size, I don't actually know. I imagine some changes were made, but we do know that this was filled with water. You did have to get it to get into a lake somehow, and all that kind of adds up as to this was probably where the Phoenix was fought at. However, another something else that lends credence to that is the fact that we know that Bassaran was not originally in this location either. Bassaran was also a completely different fight once upon a time. Here is a picture of what Bassaran originally looked like, and was also just known as the Turtle Colossus. And the fight was completely different. It more or less had you jumping onto his back rather than flipping him over and getting onto his back. And it took place in a cave of some sort, like a completely enclosed cave, much like Dirge's arena, which is where we're going to head towards next. So yeah, that was completely different. Obviously, Phoenix was cut, Bassaran was moved here, the fight was changed, and it is what we have today, which I think is one of the coolest fights in the game. Although I do lament losing the Phoenix because, again, I think it is one of the coolest fights. Now let's talk about the Griffin. Now the Griffin, unfortunately, I cannot give you an idea of where its location is because, unfortunately, if you look at the map, see how everything, you got letters and numbers on the side to mark coordinates on the map. The Phoenix, the Griffin, I believe, is somewhere around I-7 is what I believe its exact coordinates are. And as you can see, that's the middle of freaking nowhere. Exactly. It's completely inaccessible. You can't get there. And while in the PS2 version, there are remnants of its arena left and remnants of it left in the game, there's probably nothing left in the remake, I would imagine. And again, it's somewhere completely inaccessible, and that's probably not actually where it was supposed to be. I would imagine that's just where they had, outside the boundaries, placed its test arena to test things out before they moved to its actual location and implemented the fight from there. Because the arena that it's in is just a complete square or rectangle or whatever you call it. And it seems like the idea with the Griffin was to get it to run into something and jump onto its back. Seems in a lot of ways similar to something like Dirge. You were supposed to use aggro in the fight, although it is, obviously it's running on 4 legs rather than it's not a snake of any kind. So it was a little bit different, but again, it sounds like it was pretty similar to Dirge and nothing of value was lost, or at least not a whole lot of value was lost in the process. Let's move on to the next one, though, which is the Rock. Now, the Rock is one I'm actually really glad is not in the game, because I can only imagine how infuriating it must have been. But the Rock was basically Avion, but flying above land. Like, it was the exact same fight. The only difference is that you did not have water to cushion your fall if you fell off. You had ground. And unlike Phalanx, who at least gives you a chance to get close to the ground so you don't die in one fall, Rock, it sounds like, wouldn't have done that. So I would imagine that fight would have been incredibly infuriating, and again, way too similar to Avion, and I'm kind of glad they cut it. However, I do have to say I love the Rock's design. If you look at these pictures, the Rock is gorgeous, absolutely beautiful, and it is in a location that is technically in the game, but you can only access it through hacking and through cheating and using all sorts of different tactics that I know people have used to get to the remnants of its arena, but most of that area isn't even solid ground, so there's really no point in trying. Unless you really absolutely want to see it, go get an emulator and play around with the PS2 version and see what you can find. Moving on to the next one, let's talk about the Devil. And the Devil is a bit of a complicated one. It sounds like the Devil was cut because it was too similar to something like Phaedra. And why do I say that? Well, especially looking at the Devil's design, which is nothing like Phaedra's. The idea with the Devil was you hid somewhere, and you snuck up on it, and you jumped on its back. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like Phaedra's fight. The only difference is that at least Phaedra you would lure into an area. From the sounds of it, the Devil would be more like you'd wait for him to go into an area, and you'd sneak up on him like he wasn't supposed to notice you at all, or something like that. Either way, it's very similar to the idea behind Phaedra's fight, and I can see why it was cut. Although the Devil itself has a pretty cool design. Although at the same time, I do have to say, with its design, the Devil just seems like something that would be a little bit out of place to me. In Shadow of the Colossus, I should say. I think it would be more in place in something like Eco or The Last Guardian, because I feel like it fits that moniker better. In Shadow of the Colossus, everything is a lot more animalistic. Yes, I know there are the Minotaur humanistic colossi and stuff like that, but there's something so much more ancient about this and less, I guess, evil in Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus doesn't really have that whole feeling of, good versus evil in quite the exact way that Eco and The Last Guardian do, I feel like. So I feel like it would, again, it just feels a little bit more out of place in this game as opposed to those. But I can get why the idea was implemented because it very much fits the aesthetic and the theme that the whole entire trilogy brings. So I'm a little bit of a mix. I got mixed emotions on the Devil. Now, the Devil's location is actually a place that we can go to, but that area looks nothing like it does in these images, unfortunately, anymore. All of the ruins and remnants of those ruins are pretty much gone. There's a couple things you can see left, like some pillars and whatnot, but most of those are in an inaccessible spot. In all intents and purposes, it seems like they pretty much just collapsed the Devil's area off into the sea, and you can only just see like the last few bits of it over on the very south end of the map, which is kind of where we're going right now. But it's actually over off in this direction, so we're going to head over that way. But while we're heading over that way, the next one I want to talk about is the monkey. And the monkey is another one that really doesn't have a defined location, and there are absolutely no remnants of it left in the game because we're almost positive at this point that the monkey was the very first cut colossi. And there's plenty of reasons for that. Now, the most notable thing about the monkey, and the one thing we know about it the most, is that the monkey was probably the third biggest Colossus in the entire game. It was massive, absolutely huge, to the point where it probably didn't even notice Wander in some way or another. Kind of like Phalanx. Like, it was just gigantic. And it would wander around in a cave. It would climb up on the ceiling, and in some way or another, you were supposed to climb up to it and jump onto its back and stab it that way. However, from the sounds of it either, a lot of the mechanics that were necessary to make the monkey work just are not prevalent in the game. The monkey was too huge. The monkey was too unwieldy. They didn't know where to put it. So many different possible combinations of issues could have arisen. If it was the very first cut Colossus, it definitely was not working out in one way or another. And I can see the reasons they could bring up as to why it didn't work. And it totally makes sense to me. I mean, it just seems like it was rather ambitious and cool of an idea, but gigantic and unwieldy as heck. So yeah, unfortunately that one is gone as well, but there's probably no chance we'd ever see that thing come back. Now let's move on to Sirius. Now Sirius, we're actually very close to Sirius's location. It's something like this. This isn't the exact spot, but you can go to the exact spot where you fight Sirius in this game because the remnants of his battlefield are totally still there. There are actually some rocks that I will show a screenshot of right now that totally still exist in the game, and I could go walk to them right now, even in the remake, that are where you needed to get Sirius stuck. As you can see, Sirius is a bit of a smaller Colossus. It's very similar to like Celosia and Cenobia, although instead of being a tiger or a cat or a dog or something like that, it is a boar. And the idea with Sirius was that you were actually supposed to fight it with aggro, which is something you don't do with Celosia and Cenobia. Sirius would chase you while you were riding aggro. You would run through these rocks. Sirius would get stuck or wedged in between the rocks, and from there you would be able to get onto it and start stabbing away. In fact, I believe right over there are the rocks in question. Now, why was Sirius cut? Well, I would imagine the biggest reason was the fact that it was very similar to Celosia and Cenobia. They probably wanted the small ones to stand out more. And there is definitely some debate that Sirius was probably a more interesting idea than like Cenobia or Celosia. To some people, I definitely disagree. I think their fights are a lot more unique. This just does sound like, in a lot of ways, a glorified version of Dirge, except for without having to aim at anything. So I don't know if I would really be a huge fan of that. Myself, at least. But I can see why people would make certain arguments for one or the other. Obviously, it was cut very late in the game because its arena completely exists and is still intact. And on top of that, I mean, it was an interesting idea. It really was. It really just is the fact that it was too similar to the other two. It was probably the last one cut when they really were like, we need an even number here. We need it to be 16. And this right here are the exact rocks that you would wedge Sirius between. Now, I do believe that there is one tiny change in these, and that is the fact that this rock behind, the Stonehenge, if you will, has collapsed. And I imagine what you were supposed to do when you got Sirius stuck was to knock this rock down somehow, which would knock the armor off. And also, I am going to grab that. Thank you very much. So yeah, unfortunately, Sirius was cut. It was the last one cut in the game. This is pretty much a confirmed fact at this point. Now let's talk about the last Colossus left, and that is the Worm. The Worm is, oh man, this is probably the other most interesting one next to, I think the Phoenix, in my opinion, and the Spider. But the Worm, it seems, was probably cut earlier on than both of those. For various reasons, we'll get into that in a second. But the Worm was, in a lot of ways, closely related to either Dirge or Phalanx. At this point, we're pretty sure it's Dirge, although there was some credence to the Phalanx theory, because you can see, based on the Worm's arena, that it looks in a lot of ways like Phalanx's arena, at least in sections. But no, it is, in fact, related to Dirge. It was supposed to be fought right after Dirge, and it was essentially supposed to be kind of like Dirge's child, in a way, or the offspring of Dirge, and after you killed Dirge, it'd get really pissed off and attack you next. It was almost, we don't know for sure if you were going to get sent back to the temple and then go fight the Worm, or if the Worm was just going to fight immediately, because either way, I think that would have been a really cool idea. The idea with the Worm is that you were supposed to stab it in the mouth rather than jump on its back, but as you can see, based on the Worm's model, there's just some things that just don't work here. First of all, it's got, grip spots underneath it, like stuff that couldn't always be available. Second of all, the Worm's massive. It's a huge Colossus. It's very unwieldy, and you have to get to its mouth, which just seems like the most, even if you get it stuck, I can't imagine how that would, based on the way the fight works, I don't know if that would be something that would be all that feasible, or something that the developers could work with. Not to mention, remember, this was developed on the PS2. Hitboxes and all that kind of stuff did not work the best back then. And sure, they could probably make it work now, but back then that was probably just something that was way too hard. And again, they said the Worm, much like the Spider, just did too much damage to Wander. And I would imagine it's a very similar explanation as the Spider, in that it probably didn't do too much damage per se, but it was at the very least unwieldy and very hard to manage in terms of its hitboxes. So unfortunately, the Worm had to be cut. And that is it for the scrapped Colossi. Now, this area right here that we were standing in is where it is presumed that the Devil was fought, up in this area. There's pretty much nothing left of its arena, because there was a lot of ruins and temple, like artifacts and stuff like that around, but none of that really remains except for that spot over there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to be it for this episode of Let's Play Shadow of the Colossus. I hope you all enjoyed it very, very much. In the next episode, we're going to be doing a little bit more exploring, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of added features that were introduced here in the remake. And after that, we are going to be taking down the final Colossus. So thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.